Okay, so I've given you all back your quizzes from last time. There's two quick things there. Like first, overall, pretty good on the first quiz. I do want to say that if you didn't do as well as you'd hoped to, two things. One, we're doing 12 of these and they're worth 10% of your grade, which means I'm going to drop the two lowest grades, right? So there is still plenty of time for improvement. The other thing I want to note about these is that in general, what I'm looking for y'all to do is not just tell me what happens in the text. I do want that, right? But I also want you to try to apply some of the themes we're talking about in the course to it, right? So try to try to read it in light of the things that we are doing in class, the things we're discussing in class, and in particular some of the theoretical stuff that we're going to be talking about, right? Okay. So does anybody have any questions about the quiz or about assignments? I will take your silence to mean no. All right, great. Then let's start talking about the knights. So what does this phrase conjure up for you all?
Aladdin.
Okay. Aladdin, okay. And when you think of Aladdin, what do you think of?
Magical carpets.
Okay. Yep, magic carpets, okay. Genies. What else?
Jinns.
What's that?
Jinns.
Okay.
Know what they're called? Like,
Yeah. So genie is a kind of anglicization of the Arabic word jinn.
Because I thought genies were good and then jinns were the bad ones. Like when Jafar turned into a big thing.
Yeah, genie is actually just a kind of like a kind of bad transliteration into English of the word jinn. So jinns themselves are neither entirely good nor entirely, like there are good jinn and there are bad jinn. So jinn come from pre-Islamic Arabic folklore and then kind of get worked into the bigger framework of Islam. They are spirits made from smokeless fire. And some jinn worship Allah, and others go their own way and do not, right? So that's kind of the distinction there between good jinn and bad jinn, right? Now, when we think about Aladdin, what version of Aladdin are you guys usually thinking of? Yeah. What's that? Okay, yeah, the Robin Williams genie, yeah, the Disney Aladdin, right? You are thinking generally speaking of this, and now we wait. I think this is important because this actually does tell us a lot about how this text is typically received in contemporary popular culture, right? So most of our first encounters with it are with a cartoon with the shape-shifting genie who grants wishes, right? What's the basic plot of Disney's Aladdin?
Poor street urchin.
Uh-huh.
Within a family, falls in love with his princess with the help of his genie friend, magic carpet, and monkey.
Yeah, I mean it's the basic, like the basic fairy tale plot, right? Where young man from unpromising background, overlooked for some reason, whether because he's the youngest son or because he's poor or whatever, right? Through magical assistance, achieves wealth, power, and love, right? So, when we think of a movie like Aladdin, right, what's the main audience this movie's aimed at?
Children.
Yeah, there are jokes in there for adults, right? But by and large, it's intended as a children's movie. Now, this is a movie poster from another film that was based on stories commonly associated with the 1001 Nights that was made in the early 70s. So, how many of you are familiar with the character Sinbad?
Didn't Disney also make it like a cartoon movie?
It wasn't Disney. I think it was DreamWorks.
Yeah, it was DreamWorks.
Yeah, but I remember, a Sinbad cartoon from the early 2000s, yeah. But there's a series of live-action Sinbad movies with, stop-motion monster special effects that, like, for the time were actually really cool, but kind of look clunky by today's standards. And, like, you'll often see this movie, like, late night on different cable channels if you're just kind of surfing aimlessly with nothing to, like. Odds are, if it's a Saturday night, you may land on The Golden Voyage of Sinbad and watch 15 minutes of it or so before changing the channel. What's that?
GCN.
Yeah. But yeah, so let's like kind of examine the images in the poster here. What do you notice? What stands out here?
Magical creatures in it.
For sure.
Okay, we got magical creatures, right? Yeah, we've got this, many-armed idol with swords here, right? We've got these sort of centaur creatures over here, right? There's some kind of weird golden head floating in the back, right? So yeah, we got magical creatures. Good. What else do we notice?
Lots of swords.
Swords. Swords everywhere.
Yeah, everyone's got like a sword.
Yeah.
Scantily clad.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, nobody's wearing that much clothing here. Like, the hero is bare-chested, and the heroine seems to be wearing next to nothing, right?
I'm guessing that top left corner, that's probably the bad guy. So the bad guy's clothed pretty well.
Yeah, we've got the villain in the back here, who is, heavily robed.
Oh, is that a portal? Like where the villain is?
Yeah, it looks like some kind of magic portal or something, right?
You're always going to make, like, usually the hero and the princess are always really good looking, and the villain's usually an ugly older person. It's something I've noticed watching a lot of these old movies and even some of these newer movies is the hero or the heroine or whoever, the good guys are always good looking most of the time, where the bad guys ugly looking. Maybe not outside, but inside.
But that's also the fairy tale trope, right? It's the young and handsome hero and the young and beautiful heroine are being kept apart by an evil old wizard or witch, or like an elderly king or ogre or something like that, right? So ideas of physical beauty are very much at play here, right? And what do we notice about do any of these images seem to be like static? Like, do we seem to have any images here where anyone is just kind of like standing still and contemplating life in their situation?
No.
Yeah, there's a lot of action here, right? Everything is in motion. So does this look like it's aimed at children?
No.
Who might this be aimed at instead?
Teenagers and adults.
Yeah, probably aimed more at teenagers, right? There's something almost kind of comic book to it, yeah? Like, it doesn't look quite serious. But at the same time, the heroine's costume in particular suggests that this is maybe not quite appropriate to take your little kids to, right? So these are just two examples of the way the knights have been received in contemporary Western culture. Here's another. Does anybody recognize this video game?
Prince of Persia.
Yeah, it's one of the Prince of Persia games, exactly. So, there's nothing really specifically Middle Eastern about these games, except the design of the setting, right? Right, the architecture in the games often looks like a mosque or an Arabic palace, right, or a Persian palace. Now, if we go back further in time, this is closer to the way the knights were often imagined in the 18th and 19th centuries. So this is an image type. This is a genre of primarily French and English art that's called an odalisque. And the odalisque was intended to be a kind of a representation of women in the harem. Right? Is everybody familiar with what a harem is? Is there anybody who doesn't know? Okay, Kathy and David, you do not? Okay, so somebody who does know what it is.
It's a harem is where a king would keep his wives and his concubines and the children.
Yeah, or at least like more generally speaking, it's the part of the house that the women live in a Muslim home, right? But yeah, the way we've tended to receive the idea is that it's where the king keeps his wives and concubines, right? And the only men permitted into the harem are usually eunuch slaves, right? They're basically men who can be trusted because they've been castrated, right? So, what do we notice about this particular image? How is it representing life in the harem?
All the women are, well, they're all naked and they're all bathing together.
Okay, yeah.
I don't think you would see men, if there were men, like not the eunuchs, but the men there, you wouldn't see such obvious nudity.
Yeah. So yeah, everybody's naked. Yeah. Okay, so we've established that. What else do you notice about this?
That one lady seems to be like the center of everyone's kind of focus.
Okay, yeah, there's one woman in the middle whom everybody else seems to be focused on and fawning over, right? What else?
There's a tiger.
Yeah, there's a tame tiger here, right?
Very luxurious image.
Yeah, the whole idea is to show like a sort of a notion of luxury and of exoticism and of kind of lazy, languid sexuality. We can also see in this picture Western racial hierarchies encoded as well, right? That there is a black woman, obviously a slave or a servant, waving a fan over off to the side, right? So, yeah, so, and what do we notice about the woman in the center? Does she look Arabic particularly?
She looks English accent, blonde hair.
Yeah, she's got blonde hair, pale skin. She looks Western European, right?
Yeah.
So this is also pretty typical of this kind of piece, right? So a further example of this kind of art, a more extreme example would be this painting by Delacroix called The Death of Sardanapalus, Now, the story of Sardanapalus is not a story from the Knights, but it's treated in a similar way, right? So Sardanapalus is a legendary king of Assyria, who supposedly, as his kingdom is being destroyed by invaders, decides instead of defending his city, he's just going to have one last great big orgy of pleasure before going out, right? And so what we have here is another, we have another way the East is often depicted in Western art, and again, the way this kind of mixes sexuality with cruelty and violence, right? Now, all of this, from the kiddie stuff to this kind of almost sadomasochist stuff from the 19th century, is part of a broader discourse about the East that is often referred to as Orientalism. Has anybody heard this term before? Does anybody know what Orientalism is? Nick?
Orientalism is the study of Eastern cultures developed by more Western cultures, like in England and France, etc. They all concluded that whatever was seen as Oriental was the opposite of what was European. So if a European value is to go to church on Sundays, the opposite would be the Orientals don't worship.
That's basically what we're talking about here. So on the one hand, Orientalism was a field of academic study that developed in Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries. And it was European scholars studying the languages and the cultures of Asia and the Middle East. But the way they painted those cultures often tended to, paint them as primitive, as lazy, as sexually indulgent, right? Essentially, the things that Europeans did not want to see themselves, as Nick was saying, they tended to project onto Middle Easterners. And the way the Knights is received is kind of one more layer to that, right? It's either kid stuff and thus trivial, or it's morally suspect and questionable, right? If we're looking at it in its more adult aspects. And did you guys find anything surprising about the portion of it that you read for today? Was there anything that kind of ran counter to your expectations of this? Or did you not have any expectations?
Well,
yeah, Grace.
I thought it was going to be like like a more complex, like lots of like vocabulary that I was gonna have to look up. And, like I thought it was gonna be like older, like not necessarily like story kind of, but this is
Okay.
like a book I actually would read.
Okay, so you were expecting the language to be a little more difficult.
Yeah.
And if you picked up an older translation, it probably would be.
Right.
Like in particular, if you picked, we'll talk a little bit about different versions of it that have kind of been handed down to us. But there's one version from the late 19th century that is noted both for its purple prose and for its filthiness. That one you would probably you'd have to have a dictionary. And you also might have to kind of step away from embarrassment now and again. So it was simpler to read than you thought it would be. If you look, did anybody have a look at the table of contents? So one thing I want to note here is that the title of this work in Arabic is Alf Layla wa Layla, which means 1001 Nights. Does it seem like there's anything close to 1001 stories in this? If they could cram that many stories into this small a book, right? I mean, that's pretty impressive, right? But yeah, clearly the number of stories we have here is considerably smaller than that. Now, as you look through the titles of the stories themselves, do you notice any tales that you would expect to be here that are conspicuous by their absence? What do you expect to be in here that's not?
Aladdin.
Okay, yeah, no Aladdin, right?
The 40 Thieves.
Yeah, no Alibaba and the 40 Thieves.
These are really the only two I can think of off the top of my head. That would be,
No Sinbad either, right?
oh, yeah.
Yeah, none of those stories are actually in here. Does anybody have any ideas as to why that might be?
They never existed in here.
Um,
It has English roots to it.
They actually are Arabic or Indian or Chinese stories like all the rest in here, right? What we have, like in the 1001 Nights, is this weird cultural stew, right? That's made up of a number of different influences. Like the stories are drawn from India, from Arabia, from Persia, from Turkey, and from China. All right, we can trace them back to all of these different cultural origins. But I think, yeah, you're thinking along the right track here.
Well, the stories in here aren't about these great adventures or these, pirates or 40 thieves or princes.
Uh-huh.
It's about, basic, it's like Aesop's fables, kind of.
Okay, yeah, there are a couple of things in here that are beast fables, right?
Yeah.
There are some talking animal stories.
And it's like one story is, a husband had not learned management. And he learned management. Now, do
Yeah.
I think he went about it in the right way? No.
Yeah. Maybe we shouldn't frame that as learning management. Right?
Being told how to.
How to get his way. Yeah, that's
Yeah. And she's trying to. These are stories that she leaves on cliffhanger. She's stretching it out to 1001 Nights so that
Sure.
she doesn't get killed.
Yeah. Yeah, we've got the right. What's going on in the frame story? The outer frame here.
Are you asking why there's so many stories?
No, I'm asking more about the structure of the text, right? That we've got like this one story that all of the other stories exist inside of, right?
And the two brothers?
Yeah, we've got our two brothers, right? Who are kings.
Are getting cheated on by their wives.
Mm-hmm.
And the Sharia, can't say that.
Yep, Sharia, yep.
Finds out his wife is cheated on him, kills his wife and all the women in the harem, and declares that he will take one wife every night
Uh-huh.
and in the morning kill her before she has a chance to, commit any cuckold him, essentially.
Yeah.
And what Shahrazad does is that for every night she tells a story.
Mm-hmm.
And leaves on a cliffhanger, so he won't kill her, so we can find out how the story ends.
Right, the idea is right to pique his curiosity enough that he will want to hear the end of the story before beheading her. Right?
Yeah.
And then he just never actually gets around to beheading her because she keeps telling you, she keeps building onto the story, right, and adding more stories, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the whole 1001 thing, right? Like in no existing manuscripts in Arabic or Persian or Urdu are there actually 1001 stories. So there are two possible explanations for this, right? One is that all of the manuscripts that we have for it might be incomplete. Maybe. The other is that 1001 in Arabic tends to signify excess or abundance. More so than it does an exact number count in a context like this, right? So 1001 Nights can really kind of just be read in this case maybe as an epic shit ton of nights, right? Yeah, go ahead.
I was also thinking, she doesn't finish each story every night.
Uh-huh.
So maybe obviously doesn't mean 1001 stories, but 1001 nights to tell all of her stories.
Sure.
To keep on sleep.
Yeah, several of the stories are drawn out, right? And indeed, often are themselves mini frames for other stories that are inside the stories, right? So if we look at the story of the merchant and the demon, right? Right, that is contained within the Shahryar and Shahrazad story, but it also contains within it the first old man's story, the second old man's story, and the third old man's story. And when we look at the story of the fisherman and the demon for next time, the framing structure of that is going to be even more complex. Right? There will be more stories within inside these smaller stories in that part of the narrative, right? So what we really have, and I'm not going to say that the stories bear no relation to each other and that they're all just kind of here to fill time, where the frame story is just an excuse to put a bunch of stories together. I think there are some common themes linking all of these. But essentially what we have here is kind of an ad hoc story collection that evolves over time and that changes as new stories are added, as older stories kind of fall out of public consciousness, right?
Could we also look at the Arabic calendar as well?
I'm going to admit that I don't really know the Arabic calendar all that well, so you can...
They might have judged their days, obviously the days, the sun comes up, the sun goes down.
Uh-huh.
But maybe the length of their months in the year, because just last month was, I'm sorry, I used to put the trivia and I know this, but last month was the Muslim New Year.
Yeah.
So
And I think Muslims and Jews both follow a lunar calendar.
Yeah.
I'm not entirely sure how either of their calendars work apart from that. I do. My wife is Jewish, so I know that certain holidays fall at different times. Sometimes Hanukkah falls, close to Thanksgiving. Other times it falls close to New Year's, right? So the same holiday never falls on the same day twice in a row, like in the Roman calendar year, which is what we basically use, right? There could be reference, like that's something maybe for a little bit further research, if that's something you're interested in, because I don't know enough. I'll be honest, I don't know enough to help you with that. That is not something that I have ever really looked into. But what I did want to talk a little bit about was sort of like how, in some ways, our reading of the Knights, despite its intricate structure as kind of trivial, is actually pretty close to the way it's been received, at least in educated elite quarters in the Arab world for most of its existence as well, right? So what we're looking at here is not so much regarded as a high literary achievement. It's regarded as like street level pop culture, basically, right? So it's not the kind of manuscript that is treated as sacred or important enough to prohibit doctoring it or tampering with it, right? So there are basically two branches of source manuscripts for this. There's a set of Syrian manuscripts and a set of Egyptian manuscripts. The translation that we have is based on the oldest of the Syrian manuscripts. Right? 4 of these exist. And the oldest dates from the 14th century. And it only contains the stories that we have here. This branch of manuscripts is regarded by scholars who care about things as more authentic. In part because it's older, and in part because all 4 manuscripts are quite similar to each other. Right? They all contain the same stories. They leave out the same stories, there's not much to choose between the 4, right? Now, the Egyptian manuscript family is later, for one thing. The earliest of these dates from the 18th century. And others, or no, from the 16th century is the oldest of these. The others date from the 18th and 19th centuries. And most Western translations of the Knights come from this Egyptian branch, which is considered less authoritative and less authentic by scholars of Arabic literature, in part because, again, like they're comparatively late, and they are also pretty variable and pretty different from one another. Now, it's also true that a lot of European translators of the Knights took the 1001 part literally, and so they rushed to find enough stories to try to fill that number, right? The first French translation, which is the first into any European language, is by a guy by the name of Antoine Galland in 1704. And Galland actually was working from the Syrian manuscripts. But Galland got to the end of the manuscript that he had. It was in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. And he's like, what the hell? Like, where are the rest of the stories? There's supposed to be 1001. You know, I promised my publisher 1001 nights, and I don't have that many. So he went around to Arabic storytellers that he knew who were living in Paris and got more stories from them, right? So stories like Aladdin, like Ali Baba, like Sinbad are authentically Middle Eastern, but they were not part of the early manuscripts of the Knights, which is why they don't appear here, right? So the first English translations of the Knights are cheap, anonymous translations of Galland's work, right? So they are just, publishers trying to capitalize on the popularity of this thing that's hot in France right now. And they just, there's no direct reference to the Arabic text, right? They're just taking the French and translating that into English. So the first attempt to translate the Knights into English from Arabic is undertaken by a guy named Edward Lane in 1839. So Lane comes up with a highly scholarly but also very prudish translation. So on the one hand, he provides copious footnotes about different cultural practices and, alternate meanings of words and things like that. But he also basically cuts out all the sexy parts. Right. All of the naughty bits end up on the cutting room floor. In the later 19th century, John Payne and Richard Burton both undertake translations. And Burton's is probably the best known of these 19th century translations. This is the one I was talking about earlier that is known for being really flowery in its language, excessively annoyingly flowery in its language, and also for being exceptionally filthy, right? So Burton doesn't just not cut out the sexy parts that Lane left out. He exaggerates them and really kind of makes them the center of the piece, which if you know anything about British art and culture in the 1880s, Burton is associated with movements that we now call aestheticism and decadence, that on the one hand celebrate the idea of art for art's sake, right? That art shouldn't have any sort of useful purpose, all it needs is to be beautiful, but that also take a kind of thrill in shocking people with examples of moral degeneracy, right? That's the decadence part. So, there was one contemporary reviewer that recommended Galland for the nursery, Lane for the study, and Burton for the sewer.
So, Galland for the nursery,
Lane for the study, and Burton for the sewer. Yep. So, the Knights shares with most contemporary pulp fantasy that idea of a kind of dodgy literary reputation, right? Fantasy is still often regarded by a lot of serious scholars and critics as kid stuff, right? Or as, too violent or too sexualized or too juvenile or whatever, right? That it's something that is often not taken seriously by literary critics. And the Knights, in addition to sort of being a series of fantastic stories, also has historically that kind of reputation, right? I think also kind of the shifting nature of its contents and the fact that there's really no such thing as an authoritative edition also kind of speaks to that. Especially given that in the 20th century, a lot of fantasy writing tended to circulate in cheap, or barely authorized paperback editions. So even the publishing history of this kind of connects with the broader genre, right? So let's kind of shift gears from talking about the history of this, about the manuscript, to talking about the text itself, right? What did you guys make of these stories? Did you notice any particular themes or patterns in them?
With the brother kings, the whole point of theirs is their wives cuckolded them, but then they help cuckold the demon.
Okay.
So that was kind of like, you're killing your wives and all these women because you were cheated on, but then you help this woman, granted, while she's married to a demon, you help her cheat.
Okay. And
What
what
makes you know better?
and what's the lesson that they draw from their encounter with the demon's wife?
That women are cunning.
Yeah, that women-
Yeah. That all women are cunning, right? That they can't be trusted, and therefore they must all be beheaded, right? So, one might argue that perhaps Shahryar and Shahzaman are missing the point, right? That something has maybe gone wrong here in their interpretation of events, right? So, when we look at Shahzaman's experience with his wife, right? What happens there? The younger brother.
Apparently he was like not like he was too thin or something, and he wasn't feeling good. But then he noticed that his brother's life isn't the best either. And so that made him feel better. And I was
Okay,
like,
yeah.
what?
Yeah,
I was like, okay.
Yeah. On the one hand, yeah, it's weird that when he sees that his brother is also being deceived, right? Oh, that makes him feel better. He starts eating again, right?
Yeah.
But if we look at like the situation between him and his wife, right? Can we turn to page 6 here, please? Can I get somebody to start reading for 10 full days he prepared himself? Page 6.
For 10 full days he prepared himself for the journey. Then he appointed a chamberlain in his place and left the city to spend the night in his tent near the vizier. At midnight he returned to his palace in the city to bid his wife goodbye. But when he entered the palace, he found his wife lying in the arms of one of the kitchen boys. When he saw them, the world turned dark before his eyes, and shaking his head, he said to himself, I am still here, and this is what she has done when I am barely outside the city? How will it be, and what will happen behind my back when I go to visit my brother in India? No, women are not to be trusted. He got exceedingly angry, adding, By God, I am king and sovereign in Samarkand.
Samarkand. Yep, it's a city in Uzbekistan.
Yet my wife has betrayed me and has inflicted this on me. As his anger boiled, he drew his sword and struck both his wife and the cook. Then he dragged them by the heels and threw them from the top of the palace to the trench below. He then left the city and going to the vizier, ordered that they depart that very hour. The drum was struck and they set out on their journey, while Shahzaman's heart was on fire because of what his wife had done to him, and how she had betrayed him with some cook, some kitchen boy. They journeyed hurriedly day and night through deserts and wilds until they reached the land of King Shahryar, who had gone out to receive them.
Okay, so let's try to pick this apart a little bit here, right? What is it that enrages Shahzaman so much about his wife's infidelity?
But he wasn't even gone yet. And she did.
It's not that she cheated on him, she cheated on him with the kitchen boy.
Yeah, it's the status of the lover that is the issue here, right? She cheats on him with a kitchen boy. Right, that's the thing that he's still dwelling on as he's riding away, right? It's, I'm a powerful king, right? I am ruler of the city of Samarkand, somewhere in Uzbekistan. And I find my wife in the arms of a kitchen boy. Now then if we look at what happens with Shahryar, right? With the older brother, as the younger brother looks on. Can I get somebody to read from page 7, starting with after his brother's departure, that last paragraph there?
After his brother's departure, Shahzaman stayed in the palace and from the window overlooking the garden, watched the birds and the trees as he thought of his wife and what she had done to him, and sighed in sorrow. While he agonized over his misfortune, gazing at the heavens and turning a distracted eye on the garden, the private gate of the brothers' palace opened and there emerged, strutting like a dark-eyed deer, the lady, his brother's wife, with 20 slave girls, 10 white and 10 black. While Shahzaman looked at them without being seen, they continued to walk until they stopped below his window. Without looking in his direction, thinking that he had gone to the hunt with his brother. Then they sat down, took off their clothes, and suddenly there were 10 slave girls and 10 black slaves, dressed in the same clothes as the girls. Then the 10 black slaves mounted the 10 girls, while the lady called Masood, Masood, and a black slave jumped from the tree to the ground, rushed to her, and raising her legs, went between her thighs and made love to her. Masood topped the lady, while the 10 slaves topped the 10 girls, and they carried on till noon. When they were done with their business, they got up and washed themselves. Then the 10 slaves put on the same clothes, mingled with the girls, and once more there appeared to be 20 slave girls. Masood himself jumped over the garden wall and disappeared, while the slave girls and the lady sauntered to the private gate, went in and locked the gate behind them, went their way. Okay, thank you. So first off, as Shahzaman is watching and pondering before he sees any of this, what is he thinking about? What is he dwelling on? His wife and what she did to him, right? Does it ever seem to occur to him what he might have done to her? Doesn't enter his thoughts, right? It's all about what she did to me. And now, what's similar, if slightly more extreme here, in what's happening with his brother's wife and concubines?
It's not only that it's a status thing, but she's waiting until he's gone and bringing it, and she's disguising the male as females.
Yeah, and in fact, they're even kind of mingling in with the household, right? Because they're disguised during the day as concubines, as female slaves. And then, when the coast is clear, they all take off the costume, right?
It's more deceptive
Uh-huh.
and on a bigger scale.
But the status is the same here, right? Both wives are going with slaves behind their husbands' backs, right? Now, if we then look at the demon, and one thing to note, in case people didn't pick up on this here, demon is just the way Hussein Hadawi is translating the word jinn. So when we talk about like demons here, we're not talking about creatures from the hells, right? We're talking about those creatures who are neither inherently good nor inherently bad that we talked about at the beginning of class. We're talking genies, basically. So what's the situation with the demon's wife?
She was stolen away on her wedding night and is kept in a glass box with 4 locks on it.
Yeah.
In the middle of the sea.
Yeah, he keeps her in the middle of a lake. In a box with 4 locks, and yet she still cuckolds him every time he lets her out, right?
And collects all the rings.
And she collects the rings, yeah, from these men, right? So this is the first story we have, by the way, in which there is a sense of the fantastic, right? First off, because we have a supernatural creature appearing here, and then also because there is clearly magic involved in keeping a woman in a box with 4 locks under a lake. But how is the demon's wife similar to Shahzaman and Shahryar's wives?
She's noble.
What's that?
Well, like, she's a noble, but, she's waiting till her husband's either is asleep.
Mm-hmm.
She sleep with the brother kings, essentially.
Uh-huh.
She waits till the coast is clear.
Let me put it another way. How much freedom does she have in her day-to-day life? Shahryar's wives are kept in a guarded palace, right? This woman is kept in a box by a demon. So the lesson here is maybe not that women are not to be trusted, but perhaps women should not be treated like slaves or prisoners, right?
I think in The Demon and His Wife, it says that when a woman has set her mind to something, she'll accomplish it by whatever means, essentially. She's got 100 wings, 100 rings, so I'm pretty sure she set her mind and accomplished it.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I mean, that takes some commitment to the cause there. So I'd like to try to look at, like, sort of as we're getting to these stories that have these more fantastic elements, I want to talk a little bit about an essay that we mentioned briefly at the beginning of the course. So this is J.R.R. Tolkien's 1939 essay on fairy stories. And Tolkien breaks down what he calls the fairy story into 4 basic elements. Right? The first he calls fantasy. The second is recovery. The third, escape. And the fourth, consolation. So fantasy is simply the making of convincing secondary worlds. Right? You use your imaginative powers to create a world that is different from our everyday world, but still operates by internally consistent rules, that is believable, right? Recovery, he calls regaining a clear view. So what he means by this is recapturing the excitement in the everyday objects through a process of defamiliarization. Right? Things that you know, things that are familiar, are presented to you in a new or different light. And as such, you see them differently, right? You can see them as though you're seeing them for the first time again, right? So by recovery, he means a kind of like recovery of your sense of wonder. Escape, he calls relief from worldly concerns or troubles. And consolation is resolution in a moment of unexpected joy. So a fairy story, according to Tolkien, will usually climax with what he calls a eucatastrophe, or good, like, which in Greek would translate to like good catastrophe, right? Or a fortunate turn. Right? Some unexpected good thing happens that leads to a happy resolution. And what I'd like to do with the stories that are more obviously fantastic in the collection than the Shahryar, Shahrazad, Shahzaman story is see to what extent Tolkien's scheme here is useful in reading them, right? How well they kind of match up to these ideas. So let's start with the story of the merchant and the demon. So what's the basic premise there? What's going on in this story? This is the first story that Shahrazad tells to Shahryar, right? On their first night together. What happens in the story of the merchant and the demon?
A merchant kills a demon's son with big pits.
Yeah. Yeah, the merchant stops to have a bite to eat. He's throwing date pits around, not looking at where they're going. And a demon appears wielding a sword, says, I have to kill you because you killed my son, right? Now, is the punishment that the demon wants to mete out to the merchant fair?
No.
Okay.
The merchant didn't do it on purpose. He said
Yeah.
it was an accident. But the demons trying to do it on purpose.
Yeah, there was no possible way the merchant could have known the demon's son was there, right? Where he was throwing the pits, he had no idea there was, it's like, how can I know your son is out walking invisible, right? And not making any sounds. Like, how can I be held responsible for this? So the demon we see here as arbitrary and cruel, right? He is going to punish this merchant for something that is not his fault. Right? Something that he did not do on purpose. Does this look similar to anything in the Frame story?
The king is punishing his new wives for something his old wife did.
Yeah, it's very similar exactly to the way Shahryar is executing all these innocent women for something that they themselves did not do, right? So he's taking his anger out on innocent targets with no justification, right? Now, let's think about this first in terms of fantasy, right? In terms of like the creation of a convincing secondary setting here, right? So what's the setting for this particular story look like?
It's in an orchard.
Okay, yeah, he's in an orchard.
Where apparently demons are just walking around.
Uh-huh. Well, and I think like that seems to be one of the rules here in this particular world, right? Is that jinn can be basically anywhere, right? But if we've got jinn everywhere, right, then how does that change the way we read the everyday world of this orchard? if there could be a jinn lurking behind every tree or every stone.
Then, given a way, the merchant should have known to be more careful with what he's doing with pigs. Because if that's a common knowledge that jinn are everywhere, then he wouldn't keep throwing it like arrows.
Let's think of it not so much in terms of common knowledge, as in how that kind of changes the way the way the reader interprets the world of the story, right? What does that do to what would otherwise be like an everyday orchard or oasis?
Defamiliarizes it.
Yeah, and kind of enchants it, right? It makes every place, like if there are, jinn walking around invisible everywhere, right? Then we're talking about a world that is on the one hand dangerous, right? But thus also kind of more exciting and more interesting. Now, I think escape and consolation are things that come a bit later in this particular narrative, right? Is justice ultimately served in this story?
For the guy that's talking to the demon, or are we're still on like the...
Yeah, does the merchant get his just desserts? By the end of this narrative.
He gets let go.
Yeah, exactly, right? So there's a literal escape for the merchant, right? That the merchant is released from this particular worldly care. But there's also that consolation, right? This eucatastrophe, this sudden fortunate turn, where the three old men show up, tell their stories, and as a result, the demon lets him go, right? So that would actually be a pretty good example of what Tolkien means by a eucatastrophe, right? This unexpected thing that happens that resolves the problem, right? And in this case, the unexpected thing that happens is the intervention of the three old men. But I think it's also probably important for the broader structure of the narrative here to look at how the old men get the merchant out of trouble. What do?
They tell the stories.
Yes. They soothe the demon's anger by telling stories. And their stories amuse the demon so much that he is willing to let the merchant go, right? Now let's look, we don't have too much time left here, but I do want to take a minute to look at the content of the merchant's stories as well, and then we can pick this up at the beginning of next class if we don't finish up with it. But what are the common elements in the two merchant stories that we actually get?
People getting turned to animals.
Okay, yeah, there are animal transformations in both. Yeah, absolutely. Good.
It's more of like a witchcraft kind of magic as opposed to like gods.
Yeah, like in the Odyssey, for the most part, like gods can just show up and do things, right?
She was like making potions and stuff.
Yeah, so not unlike Cersei, right?
There's more, they say soothsaying.
Okay.
So like where Cersei's was pharmacology, which was more herbs and plants
Uh-huh.
and things. These, and these stories, it's more the person, mostly the woman, just speaking.
Yeah. Although there is often some kind of saucer of water or something that needs to be involved. There's some kind of apparatus often involved with the spell as well. But yeah, the transformations in both cases are accomplished by women, right? In the first old man story, we have actually like something that's a little bit reminiscent of the ox and of the sun, right? Where we have the angry wife having turned the mistress and the son into cows, right? Into cattle. And then trying to convince the husband to kill them.
I was actually going to ask you about that.
Uh-huh.
Because not only does she want them killed, she wants them cooked.
Yeah.
Eaten, so it touches on that cannibal.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it does. And there is in Arabic folklore, we'll meet a more literal one of these in the next set of readings. There's a creature called a ghoul. G-H-U-L. Sometimes anglicized as G-H-O-U-L. And the ghoul is a kind of ogre that haunts graveyards and feasts on the flesh of the dead, right? So yeah, so there is this flesh-eating creature in Arabic folklore. And the wife is given, it seems, some characteristics of this creature, right? That she probably wouldn't have eaten them while they were human, but she certainly wants that to happen now, right?
She especially wants him to do it.
Yeah, she wants to make him do it, right? To eat his own flesh and blood, right? You must do the butchering, right? You must do the butchering yourself. Yeah, she doesn't just want her rival and her son out of the way. She wants her husband to do the killing himself.
And then even like he says, I prefer her as a deer. She's more beautiful in this form. Whereas a human, she gives us hateful glances.
Yeah, well, and a deer actually is often, in Arabic poetry, a deer is a symbol for beauty. Right, it's a fairly common formula for expressing beauty. The deer and the full moon are both fairly common common metaphors for beauty. Right, deer is usually it's pretty much exclusively applied to women. Full moon is applied to either sex. What's that?
Well, the stepmother says that the mistress bore him a son that was half moon.
Yeah. When you say that, when they say that's in the narrative that someone had a face like the full moon, that's it's formulaic metaphor for beauty. But yeah, so we have in the first Merchant's Tale, as we said, or the first Old Man's Tale. Okay, so the wife makes the bad transformation. So we have a woman doing evil magic here, right? But who undoes the evil magic?
The shepherd's daughter.
Yeah. So first off, how does this tell us, or what does this tell us about the text's moral attitude towards magic itself?
It's neutral.
Yeah, that magic is a morally neutral tool, right? Which for an Orthodox Christian, Jewish, or Muslim text would probably not be quite, wouldn't be an idea to find expressed there, right? But yeah, this text seems to regard magic as something that can be good or bad, right? The other, I think, more important thing here, though, is that we have a good woman undoing the harm that has been inflicted on the family by a bad woman, right? And I think here we have an intentional mirroring of Shahrazad's storytelling. Right? She is trying to undo the king's derangements, right, caused by his experience with his wife and with the woman in the box, right? She's trying to cure the king's mania for chopping off women's heads through a different kind of enchantment, right, a different kind of magic. So we are running close to time here. Does anybody have any questions about anything? Okay, so let me give you some guide questions for next time. And I think, Dalen, you are next up for your geographical region, right? Yes. So we'll do that on Wednesday as well.